Shabbat Shalom, and happy Memorial Day weekend. It's one of those holidays that we have difficulty finding the right wording for. This is, of course, Memorial Day weekend. Hopefully everybody is aware of that. We are memorializing what exactly? Those who died in the service of our country in uniform during the various conflicts that we have been embroiled in. Excellent. Where did this come from? I mean, obviously, the memorializing of soldiers and those who had perished in battle, we have been doing that since we were first in caves. But as a country, of course, we would memorialize those who fell in the Revolutionary War, those who fell in the War of 1812, but there wasn't an actual Memorial Day. There was no national commemorative day. Local communities might have a day. More likely, it was local families that would visit the graves of their loved ones at a particular time. But nationally, we did not have anything like the Memorial Day that we have now. Until? Not the 1950s, not the First World War. The idea of the Memorial Day and Remembrance Day in Europe came after World War I and the great slaughter across that continent. The Civil War. The Civil War. Here's a little tip. Anytime there is a strange history question, the answer is almost always the Civil War. Right? It's just one of those things in American history. The Civil War, for being only a few years long, had a rather outsized impact on everything that has happened since and reframing everything that had happened before. So the Civil War is a safe guess if you're not sure. So it didn't happen immediately. There, in fact, is an ongoing debate about who began the first real Memorial Day, some pointing to Lincoln's visit of Gettysburg and the placing of memorials on the grave that had been dug for the Union soldiers. Others point to the Confederate women just a few years after the war who began a custom of visiting the graves of their loved ones. And then others point to the Confederate Army veterans, the Union Army veterans who would begin to decorate and visit the graves of their fallen comrades also a few years after the war. But within a generation, Memorial Day had become a universal American custom that spread on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. That is to say, both Union soldier families and Confederate soldier families would come often to the same battlefields and there decorate the graves, remember those who had fallen, and do so in a way that was very shocking, that they were not there with recriminations. After all, the people who were placing wreaths upon the Union graves, those were relatives of those Union soldiers who had killed the people buried under the Confederate markers, and vice versa. You would think that the families would be at each other's throats. And while it is true, unfortunately, that the politics of North and South and the different ideologies that were embroiled that led into the Civil War and then were continued during the faulty Reconstructionist period and into Jim Crow and on through the other problems that our country has had, yes, all of that was still there, and unfortunately, much of that legacy continues with us. But when it came time for Memorial Day, when it came time to visit the graves, that took a back seat. The politics, the rancor, much of which was still very, very powerfully present, was not there in the cemeteries and in the war memorials across our nation. Why? How did Memorial Day, a day to commemorate the dead that was focused at those early generations, specifically on the Civil War, more than the Revolutionary War, more than the War of 1812, how did it get turned from what could have been an open, festering wound into a shared experience between North and South? Well, it comes down to numbers. How many soldiers were killed in the Civil War? 600,000. Now, I know in the 21st century, 600,000 doesn't sound like a whole lot. I mean, after all, the horrors of World War I and the horrors of World War II would put those numbers to shame. But 600,000 in the middle of the 1800s in the United States of America was a mammoth portion of the population. The entire nation, North and South, was converted to a war footing, and the entire nation, North and South, saw their sons go off to war and saw far too few of them return, and those who did return were changed forever. Again, there's a reason why the Civil War is a safe guess if you want to explain much of American history, because it absolutely changed the psychology and the feeling of the nation. And that meant that when it came time for Memorial Day, people had a choice to make. They could look across at the memorial of their opponents on the other side of the battlefield, and they could look over there and say, those dastardly people, those people that stopped us from doing insert whatever you thought you were fighting for, they are the ones who took my brave John, because that was a common name both North and South. Or you could say, my God, we stand here on a battlefield where tens of thousands are buried, dead, because we couldn't come up with a better way to settle the dispute. That our ancestors thought it was a good idea to go to war against each other in order to force what we wanted to happen to happen. And as we stand here in that hallowed space, in the shadow of the gravestones and the monuments that rise up out of those battlefields, how can I look over at them and hate them? How could I look over at them and want to fight them? No. Here, as we stand for Memorial Day, we will not be dragged into a civil war again. Yes, the North and the South continue to have arguments. Yes, political parties continue to change and shift and flow, and all of the rancor that would go along with it. But for the first decades after the Civil War, no one who visited those battlefields and decorated the graves of those hundreds of thousands of dead, which would have been millions in today's proportion of American population, no one there thought, well, let's just try again. Let's go to war again. Because all of them understood the price that had been paid. And that was the original concept of Memorial Day. Not only to honor those who had fallen, but to remember the price that had been paid when they fell. To remember the monstrous cost that the Civil War had levied against our nation. And that everyone who visited would say, as we do about the Holocaust, never again. It is shocking that America did not go into another civil war with the continued friction between different segments of our population. But Memorial Day in those early decades, Memorial Day made sure that everyone understood the price that war would bring. There's just one problem. Most of us, when we think of Memorial Day now, do not think of Antietam, Gettysburg, Manassas, or any of the great battles of the Civil War. Most of us now think about World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the wars of the 20th century, the wars maybe in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the wars that we have a closer connection to, that we have had family members who served, that we have had family members who perished. And we forget, as we look outward, as we remember those soldiers who fell to foreign enemies, that Memorial Day was first inaugurated not to honor those who had fought the foreigners, but to honor those who had fought brother to brother, had fought within our own nation. And that means, much to my fear, the message of Memorial Day from its inception is being lost. That as we honor the soldiers and they deserve such honor, we forget the message that was there from the beginning, which is that the price of war against one another is too high. That we must resolve our problems, our differences, our disagreements in some way other that doesn't include killing 600,000 of each other. For the illusion that somehow at a bayonet or at a cannon, we will be able to resolve what could not be done at a ballot box. And that will be somehow fairer than what would have been done through democracy. Memorial Day continues to valorize those who have fallen, but we have forgotten that key message. Well, I say we, I mean we as a nation. Because we as a Jew, we should understand that lesson better than any. And yet, I fear as well that many Jewish people do not understand the lesson that we had learned about civil war that indeed is much older than the lesson of American Civil War. The first civil split, of course, came Joseph and his brothers. On the stained glass window above me, they look like they sit in perfect harmony. And yet, what was the cause of Joseph being thrown down to Egypt? Rivalry, jealousy. Who is going to be in charge when dad is dead? That is what led them to sell a brother into slavery. The entire opposite of what our Torah portion today told us. It is our obligation to redeem a brother from slavery, not to sell one into slavery. And yet that led us not only into Egypt, but it led us into the despair of Egyptian bondage. But of course, we learned our lesson from that, didn't we? Of course not. How many civil strifes and conflicts were there during the days of the judges? And then finally, when we had settled down into David being our king, and Solomon, his son, ruling wisely after him, after putting down the coup of Absalom, and after putting down Adoniah's attempted coup as well, almost civil wars, then we could settle down with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, who precipitated another civil war, dividing the country between north and south, where it would stay until conquered separately by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. But of course, we'd learned our lesson by that point, surely, till, of course, the time of the Maccabees came up, the time of civil war. Maccabees began as a fight Jew against Jew of those who wished to overturn all of Judaism and embrace the Seleucid Empire completely throughout its culture and religion, and the Jews who did not want to be erased by this new group. And of course, it eventually spun into a national war. After that, of course, we had learned our lesson, right? Of course we hadn't learned our lesson. By the time of the Great War against the Romans, we were being thrown into sectarian conflict against one another, between the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Samaritans, and of course, the Zealots. Those who believe that indeed at the point of a dagger, the Sikari, that they would be able to free us from Rome and, of course, dominate their fellow Jews. Finally, by the time the Bar Kokhba revolt came around and failed, again, at the hands of someone who was not fit to lead in the first place, finally then, we settled down. Only to have the Karaite revolution come against us, dividing our people again. And we settled down until the Shabbatai Tzvi splinter group. And then we settled down until we eventually still fight the issues of the Hasidic movements, the Reform movements, the Orthodox, the Conservative. We should know better by now. We have a history that is filled with the problems of civil strife. Indeed, sinat chinam, baseless hatred, which causes brother to fight brother, was considered the ultimate cause of the destruction of the Second Temple. And yet I fear we haven't learned that either. We sit and we weep on Tisha B'Av. And we know that our brothers and sisters in other groups sit and weep on Tisha B'Av. And yet, some part of us continues to hold them as though they were the enemy in our heart. As Jews, we should know better. At our best, we have laid aside our animosity, even as we kept our differences. We have laid aside the propensity for violence, which was our calling card. Just ask the Romans. And recognize that there were different ways to settle our disputes. But it is always there, lurking under the surface. If you scratch a Jewish person, you will find someone violently passionate about what they believe. The passion is good. It has kept us alive, and indeed it is what we must be drawn for. The violence, every time we have allowed violence to be levied one against another, well, we have suffered as a nation. We have suffered as individuals. And history has been poorer as we sit on the sidelines, licking the wounds that we have inflicted upon each other. As Americans and as Jews, take this Memorial Day to recognize the truth that was there from its inception and the truth that is written across every century of Jewish history. Brother fighting brother does not solve anything. Hurting one another in order to achieve somehow supremacy over each other does not solve anything. We do not need to erase differences, debate, discussion, and all the things that make us distinct and unique. But we do have to recognize that violence will not ensure that we will win. It will only ensure that ultimate victory will be delayed. Shabbat Shalom.